how to be the world's best investor. No, seriously.
It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
So, Brian, in order to set up this show, we decided we were going to go back to childhood. We were going to go back to a familiar story that is near and dear to all of our hearts.
Mm-hmm. With a terrifying cover,
With a terrifying cover.
We're, of course, talking about Goldilocks and the Three Bears.
Now, this is not the way that I remember Goldilocks being told to me. The bears were much smaller, much friendlier, had much less sharp claws, and Goldilocks wasn't so frightened. She was just kind of awoken by the bears because she was in the bed.
Well, I think here's the big thing. Besides the fact that it's fun to walk down memory lane, think about fables and story time that we had with our loved ones.
Sure.
I think there's a reason we teach and read these books to our children. Mm-hmm. It's because there's life lessons built into them.
Morals.
And look, we're a financial show. But it is worth noting that the typical saver/investor is absolutely horrible with what they do with their money. And it's because they're outsmarting themselves. Mm-hmm. They are either doing too much, they're doing too little, and we're trying to look for that Goldilocks behavior where you do it just right.
That's exactly right. We think that a good investor is not going to be too hot, not going to be too cold, but it's going to actually exist somewhere right there in the middle. And as we've kind of been, thinking through folks that we've worked with and being in the industry for a number of years, we've really seen that there are sort of two detriments to most people's financial success. And exactly what you said. There are the types of investors that do too much, and there are the types of investors that don't do enough or do too little.
Well, and by the way, this isn't like you're either uneducated or you're an educated investor.
No, not at all.
And once you get educated, you no longer make these mistakes. I'm telling you guys, these are behavioral problems that we see with very sophisticated, very smart people. The problem is here's what I think is in common. Most of these behaviors are reactionary instead of pre-planning ahead. And let's give you some examples. Let's go ahead and talk about what is doing too much.
Yeah, when we say doing too much, most often what we're talking about are folks who struggle with overconfidence bias. And again, whenever we use vocabulary that we think you guys would want to know the definition behind, full-time equivalent Daniel comes through in the clutch for us. And this is what overconfidence bias is. It's the tendency of people to overestimate their own talents, their own skills, their own abilities. These are the folks who say, you know what? I figured out how the market works. I know how to invest. I know what I need to go buy or sell or fill in the blank.
Well, we've done this ourselves, but
and
this is that's a fancy word, overconfidence bias. But there are times all investors come together, and for you and I, you were getting your CFA.
Yep.
And I had a little extra jingle in my pocket.
Sure.
Felt like we ought to do something with that, so we bought some options on Apple. This was years ago.
Yeah, and the absolute worst possible thing happened when we did that.
We made money on our first trade.
We made money. We were successful the very first time we tried.
The worst thing happened with these type of investment things is to make money on your first trade, because that, of course, increases that overconfidence bias that we're talking about. So in addition to buying Apple options, we bought more Apple options.
Yep.
Pushed the date out a little bit later. And then we also bet against Netflix.
That's right.
Because we just knew it was overpriced at the time.
We thought the valuation was way too high. There's no way it was sustainable. This is, a decade ago now. And here's what's really frustrating. We were right.
Yeah.
We were right.
Actually, I think it was probably 2 weeks after the puts
expired
on us. The stock went for the largest drop. Everybody now knows Netflix is successful, but it went from 200 or 300 down to 42 right after our
few
options.
weeks after expiration.
We would have made a fortune off of
Absolutely.
that trade. But so that's the thing, is you can have a confidence and be completely wrong. That's one side of it. And it's really tied into one side of we talk about the roller coaster ride or the cycle of market emotions. And we put this slide, you're going to see this a few times here, is because what happens here with overconfidence bias is it's focusing on one part of that cart ride.
That's exactly right. We're focusing on the optimism, the excitement, the thrill, the euphoria of investing, and we experienced that. As soon as our Apple options, I mean, I want to say they like doubled or tripled in value. We were like, oh my goodness, we figured it out. We've cracked the code. We're going to be, gigantically rich. And I think a lot of people fall into that category. They start either having some success or they start thinking, man, I was at a cocktail party and so told me how they made all this money on this, penny stock and I got to go buy it. That's probably not the way you want to approach making investment or financial decisions.
Well, and also I want to throw some cold water in the fact that what is the most simple adage you hear about investing is that you want to buy low, sell high. Well, we also hear markets keep going higher and higher. How in the world can you buy low when markets are reaching all-time highs?
Yeah, that's a common question we get all the time from folks saying, hey, maybe we should just wait this thing out. I feel like the market's a little overpriced right now. I feel like it's a little high. And we always say, whenever someone says that, we pull out a great quote from Nick Murray. And this is what his quote says. If you think the market's too high, wait till you see it 20 years from now. Because you talk about it all the time, Brian. When you're investing, it's like a yo-yo going up and down. But it's a yo-yo going up and down, up a mountain. So even though there's these undulations, you're moving to higher and higher and higher levels. I think where people get caught is where they try to catch the very top of the yo-yo or the very bottom of the yo-yo instead of focusing on moving to higher and higher ground.
So probably a good coping mechanism if you're worried about this type of stuff, besides the timing of it, is diversification.
Absolutely.
So if you're thinking about diversification as at least as a tool that will help you with some of these behavioral issues, how about chasing the hot dot?
Yeah, this is another one, Brian. And I want to give you credit because I learned this from you. When I first came out, of my investing courses and I was working with you, you showed me this illustration. It was something I'd never seen before. And you had told me about your experience coming out in the late 90s. Folks were so excited. If anything had the word .com in it or internet in it, you were a fool if you weren't investing in that. If you were just buying the boring old S&P, you were missing out. And this is the illustration that you showed me back over a decade ago. Well, yeah, and I still think it's pertinent today.
Well, prudent investing looked like you were a fool in the 90s.
That's
now,
right.
Look, we're so old, they don't show the 90s anymore. It actually starts in 2000. But what I always told everybody is because it wasn't uncommon that in like 98, 99, you could have the S&P 500 making 28%.
Sure.
Now, everybody here listening to this, you're hearing 28%. You're like,
sign me up. I'll take that.
And you know what? Your clients were still upset with you because the information and technology funds and anything that was technology based, if you were making 28% with the S&P 500, they were making 50 to 100%. So you still looked like a dog in your client's eyes. And that's the part that I always told people, be careful chasing the hot dot, because what is the best performing asset class this year is not guaranteed. Matter of fact, behaviorally and also historically, you'll see it doesn't stay up there. It typically bounces around, and that's why you do want to spread your risk out.
If you're out there listening on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, the chart we're looking at shows a bunch of different asset classes and how they perform relative to other classes year over year. If you just sort of visually look at this and you just pick a color, like orange is one that sticks out to me, you can see that there are spreads of time, or there are strings of time where orange might be the top performer. But it is not uncommon in the years following those top years that it is the bottom performer. So if you're trying to chase and invest in the best investment of last year, the best thing to do last year, there's a good chance that you're setting yourself up to actually buy high and sell low. And that's why we think diversifying makes all the sense in the world. So if you are entering into the market, even into a really strong bull market, if you have the right diversification in place, you can set yourself up for long-term success.
So that's overconfidence, that's overtrading, that's doing too much. In reality, most reactionary behavior is going to be wrong. That's why you want to pre-plan. But there's one more side I want to talk about, which is we see this on the other side is we'll have somebody reach out to us and they'll be like, I have 6 figures of cash. I'm like, well, is that what your emergency reserves need to be? Nope. And I'm like, well, how do you have, I've had clients have 7 figures of cash or prospects that came to us. And I'm like, how in the world do you end up with 7 figures of cash? And they're like, well, I got scared. I got nervous. I got out. and it just kept going up on me. And
Yeah,
then
I was waiting for the pullback.
I was waiting for it to come down, and then before I knew it, I somehow had all this cash, and I was just so scared of making a mistake. I was locked into analysis paralysis. So we see this all the time of not doing enough.
Yeah, paralysis by analysis occurs when someone overanalyzes or overthinks a decision to the point of being unable to take any action at all. Rather than doing anything, they sit there and do nothing.
So, and once again, pulling up our cycle of market emotions, this is focusing on the wrong side of it. This is what I think is interesting, and this is what's so cruel about human psychology. When we have overconfidence bias, is actually the tippity top of the markets, and that's the maximum point of financial risk.
Yep.
When markets are the cheapest and best maximum opportunity to buy, we're all scared to death because that's where you have the anxiety, the fear, the desperation, the panic, the capitulation.
Yep.
These are all the things that you should be excited about, but because of our emotions, you actually are locked into, there's no way I would invest right now.
Now, I've heard you say this all the time, Brian. You came up with this idea that you talk about a lot, this 88 times over, that $1 can turn into $88 for a 20-year-old if they're investing by the time they get to 65. And you'll talk to these prospects who have $1 million in cash. They're like, oh, I don't know what to do and I don't want to do. And I've literally heard you say this. You'll say, you've got to do something. Yes. You don't need to invest at all. You just need to do something, because if you do nothing, do you know how much your multiplier from an investment perspective is? And the answer is zero.
Yeah.
You can have $1 million sitting in cash. If you have $1 million in cash and you want to know how much it's going to be worth in the future if you don't put it to work for you, 1 million times a zero multiplier is still going to be zero. It's not going to move anywhere. You're not going to have any of that
actually is
compounding
working
growth.
against you because of inflation
That's
and
right.
other things. But that's what, so we want to do, this is all to set up. This was a 10-minute setup to let you know we've now figured out, let's figure out somebody who actually, let's assume Michael J. Fox and the doc got together.
Okay.
And they came up with a time machine. We'll just even say it looked like a DeLorean.
Maybe it was a DeLorean.
And they had the ability, they had the Farmer's Almanac, whatever you want to call it, and they were either able to go back in time and do the best opportunities to buy, meaning that markets got their teeth kicked in. Mm-hmm. You had the Farmer's Almanac of what was going on with the S&P 500. You bought in on the perfect days to invest. Mm-hmm. And we're going to flip the script and we're going to talk about the world's worst investor.
Sure.
Somebody who actually did not have the Farmer's Almanac, let their emotions get to them and waited for their buddies to come to them, get them excited about the markets, bought at the tippity top of the market.
Yep.
And then they ended up losing, obviously. What did that do to in the long term? And here's what I think is interesting about all these different analysis. And then we have the third option that we'll talk about. But here's what I think is interesting. In both of these scenarios, and I'm going to let Bo set it up.
Sure.
Nobody ever sells. Mm-hmm. So I do want to give these behaviors, this is the positive of at least they held on to the assets through the entire process. But set this up completely, Bo.
Yeah, so what if you're the best market timer ever? And what you're going to do is we went back to 1980, and the average income, according to the Social Security Administration in 1980, was $12,513. And let's assume that you listened to the Money Guy show that wasn't around in 1980, but let's assume that you did listen to it, and you were going to save 25% of your income, or a little over $260 per month. But you said, you know what? Because I have my Farmer's Almanac, I'm only going to buy at the very bottom of a bear market. So I'm going to save my $260 a month, and I'm going to have it just build up in cash. And it's going to go to cash and go to cash and go to cash. And I'm going to assume that my cash can earn 2%. Right now today, that sounds pretty stinking good. It's going to earn 2%. And then when the market hits the very bottom day, then I'm going to buy. Well, this is what we found when we went all the way back to 1980, all the way through now. There were a couple buying opportunities, specifically October 19th, 1987, that was Black Monday. October 11th, 1990, that was the Kuwait War, the bottom of that period. October 9th, 2002, this is the one that you were talking about. This is the very bottom of the dot-com bubble. March 9th, 2009, that's one we certainly remember. That was the bottom of the Great Recession or the housing crisis. And then we can even look at this year. On March 23rd of 2020, was the lowest point of what we've begun to dub the COVID crash. So here is 5 buying opportunities. Where in between these, you're going to build cash, build cash, build cash. You have a pot of money, and then on that lowest day, you're going to deploy all that cash on those days.
So
Make
here's
sense?
something I think is interesting, because we're going to be using these key dates as big parts, because this is the biggest things that have happened since 1980. There's a lot of stuff. It's just like we're in a pandemic year. And this year's been it continues to just be weird.
Sure.
I mean, you know, I have a trip that was supposed to happen tomorrow. Because of this pandemic, some things are getting thrown off once again. It's the year that keeps on giving. But I want you to know, this happens all the time, guys. And this is part of life, is that you will have the Black Monday. You'll have wars. You will have technology disruptions, like, you know, or a dot-com bubble where people just were paying ridiculous sums. It wasn't worth it. The housing crisis. I mean, these ripple effects. Bo, I even told you, because you saw the Kuwait War. I said, you realize without the Kuwait War, Brian Preston doesn't become a financial advisor. You don't get the Money Guy show. The butterfly effect from all of this stuff already lives in our lives.
Sure.
Don't let it also disrupt your investment life as well.
I love it. So this is what full-time equivalent Daniel has dubbed this investor. This is Billy the Best. Right?
Billy the Best.
That's what he called this investor.
We played some Karate Kid music in preparation for this.
So Billy the Best market timer ever saved his cash till the market bottomed out and always invested exactly the right time. So you can actually see, again, if you're out on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, any of those places, go out to YouTube so you can see this visual. And you can kind of see the orange cash building up and then it invests. And the orange cash building up and then it invests. And orange cash building up and then it invests. Well, what we determined is throughout this 40-year cycle, Billy will have saved $127,222. That's how much money he saved. But because his timing was so good, the value of his investments at the end of 2020, or on January of 2020, at September of 2020, was $1.4 million.
All from doing $260 a month.
$267 a month. Nothing incredibly difficult about that.
So that's pretty powerful. That's the best. Now look, that's not reality, because we don't have the time machine.
Right.
The reality is you're going to have the brother-in-law that tells you a hot stock tip or something and gets you excited at the world's worst time to invest. So let's talk about what happens if you're actually, because I've done this show before, where's Bob, the world market timer. Now, FTE Daniel, he gets creative with his names. He didn't like Bob, the world's worst market timer. He went with another route.
He went with Unlucky Ursula, because
I like it, a little Disney
works.
flavor
a little
there.
Disney. So if Unlucky Ursula was the worst market timer ever, let's walk back through our assumptions. In 1980, the average income was $12,513. Ursula knows that she's supposed to be saving 25% of her income. So she's going to save a little over $260 per month. But instead of investing at the bottom of each of these bear markets, she's going to invest at the top of each of the bull markets.
So, I mean, she's kind of a scared person.
She's
going to wait.
Until it feels good.
It feels really comfortable. You know, this is, everybody around her is making money. How can she not be making money? So she waits till the tippity top, pulls the trigger. This is what the typical investor does, by the way, and then unloads all the cash that she has.
So she ends up investing in August of 1987, in July of 1990, in September of 2000, in October of 2007, and then pre-COVID, she invests in January of 2020. So again, if we look at the illustration, Ursula always invests her cash right before a market crash. Now, her cash is earning 2% until then, but when the market hits the very peak, she puts it to work. So she invests at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different times, and this is what we find. Ursula, over this 40-year period, invests the same $127,222, but her portfolio is, I'm going to say only in air quotes, only $800 and almost $93,000.
That's so worth repeating, because, I mean, realize that this is the worst market timer since 1980. And they still end up with almost $1 million of assets, doing it the worst
way
possible way you could. And this is something, you know, you could be a bad investor, and this is a more likely scenario than I think Billy the Best, because you don't have the time machine. You can't go back. The flux capacitor hasn't been invented yet, so it's not going to happen. But I do think this gives you a lot of of feeling good in the fact that you can be horrible at something and still be successful.
Yep.
And that's the part. I think a lot of people look at successful investing and they think of how much luck has to be involved in it. This shows, nope, you just got to be part of it. It's not timing the market, it's time in the market.
Love it.
So, and we're going to prove you, we're going to go one step further on this because you guys know all this, my head going back and forth. Do we wait for the best time to buy? Do we wait for the worst time to buy? When should you actually try to do this the most efficient, most unemotional, and the most systematic way that ties into everything we've ever talked about here at the Money Guy Show?
Yeah, so what if you don't time the market? What's that look like? And so again, since Daniel comes up with all of our characters, we now have DCA Dave, or dollar cost averaging Dave. And this is what we know. Average income in 1980, $12,500. Dave also knows he's supposed to save 25% of his gross income, so he's going to save a little over $260 every month. But he's not going to park it in cash. He's just going to put it in the market, set it and forget it, and let it invest. He's just going to let it run and run and run and run and run. So he invests every month, no matter what. Good times, bad times.
This seems easy.
This is the boring one.
This is set it and forget it.
This is the lazy way to invest. So this is what we find, that DCA Dave doesn't try to time it, and he just does his 260. And by the way, we're investing in the S&P 500. That's all we're doing here. We're making it super, super easy. This is what we found. Dave saved the same $127,222. But by being lazy and boring and not outsmarting himself, his portfolio actually grows to almost $1.7 million.
What I think is so interesting is that this is a career. I mean, because 1980 to now, you're probably getting close to your gold watch moment.
Sure.
Because you started, I mean, I entered the workforce in the mid-90s.
Yep.
So this is somebody who is, would have been my mentor, who's now leaving the workforce. I think seeing that somebody over their lifetime saved $127,000 and now it's worth over $1.5 million, close to $1.7 million actually.
Unbelievable.
What a great savings career. And this also ties into, I've often told you guys, I grew up in a household where saving was never the issue. My parents never made great incomes, but they were great stewards with their resources. Meanwhile, my wife, my in-laws, also good savers, but they actually did something. They put the money in the Fidelity Magellan Fund, whereas my dad did CDs.
Sure.
And you can quickly see just putting the money to work, putting in something as simple as the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies in the United States. Guys, in a lot of ways, that's good enough.
Yep.
I mean, you can do a lot of good by just being deliberate, systematic, and not letting your emotions screw it all up.
What I think is great, Brian, you already said this, you just got to show up. You just got to be involved. Because if we look at the recap, all three of these folks, Billy the Best, Unlucky Ursula, and DCA Dave, invested the exact same amount of money, a little over $127,000. Billy ended up with $1.4 million, and he really had it figured out. Ursula was clueless and couldn't have done it worse, and she ends up with almost $900,000. But DCA Dave, boring, lazy, didn't think about it, just stay consistent, $1.7 million. What I think is beautiful is all three of these folks have a great retirement portfolio. They've got a great pot of assets built up because they at least did something. You notice none of them made the choice to not invest or to not be involved in the market or to not defer gratification or to not save the dollars. They did something, and we just think if you take the easy route, it's likely going to work out better for you.
Well, I actually took something else from this.
Okay, well, I will redact all my previous statements.
Well, think about this. I think the reason we don't have a flux capacitor is because the time machines just don't yield enough dividends.
It doesn't work,
because if you look at on the S&P 500, you actually came out better being a dollar cost averager than running the strategy of waiting for the most perfect opportune time because you have the Farmer's Almanac and then making it happen. I mean, if this thing had better alpha, mankind would have probably found a way to get the flux capacitor how to do it. So it once again shows you don't have to make wealth creation complicated. It's surprisingly, just exceedingly simple. But people make it so complicated because they don't do the behaviors that will lead to success. So let's focus on what you can control. And Bo, what is that?
Yeah, there are sort of three things that we think you ought to focus on when it comes to investing. Number one is taxes. Number two is fees. And number three is your risk exposure. Those are things that don't have outside force. Those are things that you can impact. So let's kind of dive into each one of these a little more in depth. Let's look at taxes first.
So the first thing, I think it's interesting, we often talk about this bucket strategy where just like I want you to diversify your investments between different asset classes, I want you to diversify where you're paying taxes from in retirement. Because, guys, if you can have money in after-tax assets, that's like your brokerage accounts, your individual or joint. If you can have tax-deferred, like your 401ks or IRAs, and then you can have tax-free, that's your Roth accounts, your Roth employer plans, your Roth IRA. You can manipulate legally the tax code, and we have a perfect illustration that shows this.
Yeah, this bucket kind of shows how each of these tax buckets grow. Now, what I think is really interesting is we had someone, we have this financial order of operations course out there that you can go work through, and I had someone ask me in the private Facebook group, hey, I don't understand. Right now, based on my income, I'm doing my Roth IRA, and I'm doing my Roth 401k, and I don't have an employer match. Do I need to try to focus on that tax-deferred bucket? Because I'm building up my brokerage account and I'm building up my tax-free account. Odds are if you fall into that snare, then yeah, you might only have two of those buckets. You might have the tax-deferred bucket. But most folks, if you're participating in an employer plan that does some sort of matching, the money that your employer puts in, it is going to be pre-tax. So likely you're going to build up that tax-deferred bucket. Well, if we know right now we can do tax-deferred contributions and get a current year tax benefit, we don't know what the future holds. Again, if we had the flux capacitor figured out, we would just fast forward to the future, go to our retirement date, see what tax policy is, come back to today, and make perfect tax decisions. Since we can't do that, we have to try to build up three of the buckets or two of the buckets or as many of the buckets as makes sense in our situation so that when we do get to retirement in an unknown tax environment, we have maximum flexibility.
Yeah. And I think Bo's right on, is that even if you were focusing all your saving efforts on tax-free assets like Roth or after-tax individual type say brokerage account, you're still going to likely end up with some tax deferred just because of that match.
Yep.
Those employers, if they're giving you any free money, it's going to probably show up in some type of tax deferred account.
So one of the questions that folks always end up asking us is, okay, well, how do I decide between Roth and pre-tax, right? So you said that for some folks, maybe they do want to build that bucket, and some folks, they don't want to build that bucket. How do I know which makes sense for me?
It's all going to be driven by age. Obviously, the younger you are, the more you want to take advantage of tax-free growth.
Sure.
That's where the Roth assets. But there will come a crossover moment where you're just going to, if you're in the tippity top of income, meaning you're in a very high income tax situation, or maybe you're just having a crazy year. It's not going to be 2020, but in some other year, you're having a crazy great income year. That might be something where you deliberately on those years, you try to take a tax-deferred savings, meaning you put the money in pre-tax, it grows, whether it's current income, whether it's capital gains, whether it's, all the different income sources, they won't tax you on it until you pull that money out, but it's taxed at ordinary income tax rates. So you're hoping, the game is that if you're in a super high tax bracket because you're in a high income situation now, you're hoping when you retire, your income sources are much lower and you're in a much lower tax bracket. So hopefully there's some type of arbitrage situation you can do with the tax rates too.
Yeah, there's a real, and we have sort of a loose rule of thumb. Now, this isn't scientific. This is a little bit of art. But if you look at your federal marginal rate and your state marginal rate, and you add those two up and they're above 30%, it probably makes sense for you to put some effort or attention into the pre-tax portion. If you're below 25% when you look at those two marginal rates combined, Roth probably makes a lot of sense for you. If you're somewhere between 25 to 30%, that's where it gets a little more gray, a little more nuance, and it comes back to your specific situation, like your age, goals, account structure, and those sorts of things.
And then I think we couldn't move on past this without thinking about the after-tax or those individual or joint brokerage accounts.
Sure.
It's nice to have some assets there just so you can do some tax loss harvesting.
Yep.
So you can focus on capital gains avoidance and other things. There's parts of how you look at your tax location that will impact. And that's why you'll hear us all the time talk about we love index target retirement funds. But you're going to notice, guys, once you build up your assets to $500,000 or so, you're going to want to have more control on how you're paying income taxes in your portfolios with your investments. And that's probably when you will graduate from those target retirement funds.
All right, so taxes are the first thing that we can control. The next thing that we can control inside of our portfolio when it comes to investing is fees. And the number one fee that most people often think about when it comes to investing is the internal operating expenses of the funds that you're investing in. So if you're investing in mutual funds, there's some cost to do that. There are, they got to keep the lights on, they got to have the research, they got to have the trading software, they got to do all the things. Well, there's a cost to that. And unfortunately, all funds are not created equal when it comes to internal operating expenses.
No, we've done a lot of shows on index investing versus, using the active managers. And the thing is that the index funds just typically, especially on like in asset classes like large cap, international, I think it's even drifted into small cap in a lot of ways. You're going to find that the lion's share, I'm talking like 80% if you get into long-term time horizons, because consistency bias. Here's the thing. You can find a manager that can outperform the index a year.
This year.
But you won't find that same manager did it next year or the following year. It's just the data falls off. I'm just telling you, long term, about 80% of the time the index funds are going to outperform. So save the money, because the reason is it's back to the fees. If you know that an internal operating expense of an active management fund is over 1.5%, and then the index fund is practically free, that's a 1.5% headwind that they're going to have to overcome. That makes it much, much harder. And then you need to pay attention to, are there commissions? Are there loads? Are there no loads? And then that even plays into when I mention things like index funds. Commission advisors have realized, hey, we can do this too. And they'll structure now. A lot of them have gone to wrap accounts so they can do ETFs, so they can do these mutual funds. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. Takes out some of these loads, but it does still make you need to pay attention to the fees that you're paying on those wrap accounts as well.
Absolutely. And so then the other thing that you need to think about is if you are working with an advisor, you really need to understand how your advisor is getting paid. And there's really 3 different business models. There are commission-based advisors. Those are the ones that sell products. So if they recommend investment ABC or insurance policy XYZ, they get paid a commission for the product that they sell. We're not saying anything bad about that. It's just a different way that the industry works. On the other side of the industry, advisors like what we do at Abound Wealth, they are fee only. The only way that we get paid is directly from our client. There is no outside third-party company compensating us. We like that because what it allows us to do is remove a lot of conflicts of interest. And whether we recommend to our clients strategy A or strategy B or strategy C, we're indifferent to which ones they select because they're paying us for the advice and for the consultation, not we're getting paid for the product that we're pushing. And then where it gets a little confusing is there are fee-based advisors that's some sort of blend of the two. They might have that wrap account like you talk about, but they also might sell commissions. You just need to understand what fees are you paying, because this one I get from prospects all the time, or I used to get it a lot more. I'll say, oh, what do you pay your advisor? Oh, I don't pay them anything. The company pays. They're for free. They're just nice guys. There's no free lunch. Your advisor's getting paid. You need to understand how they're getting paid.
Well, we actually have a resource. You go to moneyguy.com/resources. We'll have 8 questions you ask financial advisors. I'll close it out with the one last thing. I thought this was settled, but it seems to have come back. Fiduciary standard.
That's a great one.
Guys, please understand, you need to ask any advisor, what standard are you held to? Are you suitability or are you fiduciary standard? Fiduciary is a legal term where they have to actually put your interest ahead of their own legally, or you can hold them accountable for it. It's a much higher standard. It's actually, believe me, my E&O insurance, my errors and omission insurance is substantially higher because of it as well. So, and you'll notice that in the structure of these advisors, because suitability, and I've used this analogy before, you're not going to ever find a nutritionist that recommends candy bars, but candy bars are suitable to be consumed by humans.
They'll keep you alive.
And you can do it. You're not going. If you eat a candy bar and your stomach hurts, nobody in court is going to give you any benefit or coverage for eating that candy bar. If the nutritionist recommended every day you should eat 10 candy bars, and you got sick, you could probably take that nutritionist because they're supposed to be telling you what's the best thing to put in your body. They have a standard, a fiduciary standard to do that. You can hold them to a much higher standard. It's the same thing with your investment advisor. So make sure you're not getting an advisor recommending cheeseburger. You're actually getting somebody that's giving you what's the best thing in your best interest.
I love it. So, all right. So we've talked about taxes are something we can control. Fees are something we can control. And the other thing, and this kind of ties in with the best market timer and the worst market timer and the folks that are scared and the folks that are over optimistic. We think that a third thing that you can control is your risk exposure. When it does come to investing, even though all investing has some sort of risk, you get to control where on the risk spectrum that you live. And we think that the first thing you have to understand when it comes to risk is the difference in risk tolerance and risk capacity.
Yeah, risk tolerance just means, are you a cowboy, cowgirl? You really, because there's a lot of people that have a lot of tolerance to ups and downs. We work with financial mutants all over the country.
Business owners.
And by the way, here's the thing. I work with some very successful people. We have to have a lot of discussions because they can be 70 years old, still ready to rip and go at it. Doesn't mean they should. Just because you can handle the risk tolerance doesn't mean you have the time for the market to recover. Because think about this. You're 70 years old, market loses 35, 40%. You're diversified like you're 25 instead of 70. It might take you realistically 7 to 10 years to fully recover. Your time horizon doesn't say that is appropriate.
If you're living off those assets,
from a risk capacity standpoint.
That's exactly right. You have to understand those two separate sides of the equation. How much can you handle, but also how much should you handle?
So that's why don't just assume because you like risk, you can handle risk, you'll be okay. Because that's why I see that all the time out there in a lot of case study. And that's why there's a difference between just building wealth and keeping wealth. If you don't have a healthy respect of fear of what you could be losing, you're probably doing it wrong.
So you can understand the differences in risk. The other thing that you can make sure you focus on is the appropriate mix of risk on and risk off assets. We see this all the time, that the way that you control the risk exposure is by the composition of your portfolio, and there should be an appropriate glide path for you. It's okay when you're young, when you're starting out, when you're in your 20s and 30s, if you have a really aggressive portfolio. Maybe it's more stocks and less bonds, or less risk-off assets. But as you move through time, and as you do get closer and closer to retirement, and as the portfolio does get bigger and bigger, you do want to make sure that you have that risk composition correct inside of your portfolio.
And then that leads to the last one, I think not only in 2020, we've gotten the pandemic, we've got an election year.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and we've done a show on how to election-proof your finances because I have so many people who I know in the community or have known at some point in my life reaching out and going, what are you doing about this election?
What should I do?
And by the way, it's not one-sided. It's so funny is that what one group is worried about this president, the other group is just as worried about this president. It's just such a bizarre time right now. And what I always ask them is this last component. I say, hey, over the next 2 years, do you have enough cash to cover any of the needs that might come your way? I'm not talking about you need to have 2 years worth of cash reserves. I'm saying for living expenses, I'm saying do you have 2 years worth of anything that could be coming your way you have covered, for emergencies and so forth. Now, look, if you're a retiree, maybe you will have 24 months of cash reserves for living expenses. But I'm thinking for the typical person that has a good job, you're in a good situation, you just need to be thinking about, do I have kids going to college next year? Do I have enough money in cash reserves so if the hot water heater breaks? Make sure you're thinking about all those things, and that's going to give you a lot more safety net to understand what you can and cannot handle emotionally.
When we work with clients who are easing into retirement or approaching that retirement date, one of the biggest fears they always have is, what happens if I retire at the worst time? What happens if I retire and 2008 happens? What happens if I retire and COVID happens? We say, well, if that happens, we've got your portfolio structured in such a way that you can weather that storm. And because we have been building up your cash, because you have that 12, 18, 24, 36 months of cash, you don't care if the market drops because you have enough time to let it come back. Because you've taken the appropriate risk measures, you've built your portfolio suitable to your stage of life, you can weather whatever storm the market throws at you.
Yeah, I always tell people, if you're in your 20s, 30s and even 40s and the market gets beat up and you still have a good job, you ought to celebrate the volatility.
You'd be excited, yeah.
Because in the long term, it's not boring markets where you make a lot of money. It's actually the volatility if you're buying into it every month. And that's going back to the root discussion we were having. How do you be the best market timer? How do you be the best investor? Guys, have a plan.
That's it.
Have a process. No, it's your savings rate is going to be much more powerful than a lot of these other components that we're talking about. So if you're not putting enough respect into, am I saving for the future? Am I creating an automatic behavior that will put this money into play for the long term? So emotionally, I'm not derailing myself. We've already heard about you can have analysis paralysis by not doing enough, or you can have overconfidence bias where you're actually doing too much. There's something right there in the middle, and that's that dollar cost averaging plan where every month you're doing the behavior that I think you'll find is your Goldilocks strategy that's going to get you through whatever comes your way.
If you want a little bit more, a little bit extra, you can go out to our website, moneyguide.com/resources. Out there we have deliverables, PDFs. Brian, you mentioned the 8 questions you can ask your advisor. These are all tools we want you to take and use. They are completely free. They are completely at your disposal because we want you to be the world's best investor. We want you to understand what and how to get to financial abundance. And we're so happy we get to be your co-pilots on this journey.
Hey, and FTE Daniel, well done on the case studies, brother. Bo and I was like, because we had somebody mention to us, hey, have y'all done a show on when you should invest, how you should do it, good times, bad times? It's like, of course we have.
Yeah, we have.
And when I'm pulled the data, we had no visuals because it was before we had Reby and Daniel on the team. And I was like, oh my goodness, this show has got to get better right here, right now. So guys, share this friends, family, share it with anybody you think could benefit, because I think now that we've added the case studies that this team does so well that makes this world class, it's going to be great for you just to learn from this so you can learn and apply this in your own personal finances so you're insulated but also become more successful. I'm your host, Brian Preston. Money Guy Team out.